So, I really don't know how to lead into this. Most of us are familiar with a certain electric country song called Cotton Eye Joe, released in 1994 by the band Rednex. But what many people probably don't know, and what I didn't know until recently, is that the song Cotton Eye Joe actually goes all the way back to the pre-Civil War southern United States, and there's a lot more drama behind it than I originally thought, and I want to talk about it. No, I'm not becoming a Southern culture channel. We will be spilling some tea today, but there is nothing sweet about it. So without any further ado, let's jump right into it. Before we can look at the lyrics, we first need to examine the title. We know it's about a man named Joe, but what does it mean to be cotton-eyed? Well, we actually don't know, but there are a couple of theories. One is that it refers to being drunk, either from moonshine in true southern fashion, or methanol, which is definitely not drinking alcohol, in case you were wondering. It could also be a reference to white eyes caused by trachoma, syphilis, cataracts, or glaucoma. A significantly more mild explanation is that cotton-eyed refers to the contrast between dark skin and white eyes in black people. Finally, perhaps the most literal interpretation is that it's a reference to cotton balls being used in place of glass eyes due to a lack of medical equipment. Like I said, we're not really sure which of these interpretations was the original intended meaning, so I'm just going to list them all here and move on to our first documented lyrics. The first version of the song we know of was published in 1882, republished in 1910, and was heard by a woman named Louise Clark Pyrnelle on her father's plantation in Alabama. Apparently, someone thought it would be a good idea to use a written accent when writing the song, so I will be translating for you as I read. Cotton-eyed Joe, what did make you starve me so? For to take my girl away from me and kyar her plumb to Tennessee. If it hadn't been for Cotton-eyed Joe, I'd have been married long ago. This first stanza sets up the central story that all different versions of the song have in common. The narrator was in love with the girl who they wanted to marry until some man named Joe, who is described by the narrator as cotton-eyed, comes along and whisks her away. And unlike in later versions, we actually know where he went. He kyar'd her plumb to Tennessee. In all seriousness though, I can't tell if this is supposed to be carry or an older meaning of the word car being used as a verb. This is why we don't do written accent. Let's move on. His eyes was crossed and his nose was flat, and his teeth was out, but what of that? For he was tall and he was slim, and so my girl, she followed him. If it hadn't been for Cotton-eyed Joe, I'd have been married long ago. Here we have our first description of Cotton-eyed Joe. He's described as cross-eyed, which, according to Mayo Clinic, could be a medical condition called strabismus. He's also tall and slim, with a flat nose and an overbite. This description of Cotton-eyed Joe is then contrasted with a description of the girl. No girl so handsome could be found, not in all this country round, with her kinky head and her eyes so bright, with her lips so red and her teeth so white. If it hadn't been for Cotton-eyed Joe, I'd have been married long ago. So the girl that ran off to be with Cotton-eyed Joe is just stunning. I'm talking modeling for Plantation Weekly levels of gorgeous. She's described as having bright eyes, red lips, and white teeth, which I'm sure was a hard-to-find quality in the mid-19th century. She's also specifically described as having kinky hair, which we'll come back to in a minute. Finally, the song ends with the last two stanzas. And I loved that girl with all my heart, and she swore from me she'd never part. But then with Joe she runned away, and left me here for to weep all day. Oh Cotton-eyed Joe, what did make you starve me so? Oh Joe, if it hadn't been for you, I'd have married that girl for true. Overall, this version of Cotton-eyed Joe is just very sad. It's a story of lost love and despair that I'm sure many people can relate to, and represents pretty well what the many different versions of this song are all about. Our second published version of Cotton-eyed Joe comes to us in 1925 from Dorothy Scarborough, a folklorist. It was compiled from several different accounts, and it reads as following. Don't you remember, don't you know, don't you remember Cotton-eyed Joe? Cotton-eyed Joe, what did make you treat me so? I'd have been married 40 years ago if it hadn't have been for Cotton Eye Joe. So far, not too different from the one we saw before. The newly added time depth, 40 years, actually lines up pretty well with this 1925 version being published and the 1882 version. Cotton Eye Joe, he was the bleep that starved me so, took my girl away from me, carried her off to Tennessee. I'd have been married 40 years ago if it hadn't have been for Cotton Eye Joe. So it was supposed to be carry her off to Tennessee. Y'all messing me up with this Kiar business. Besides that, I think the other major takeaway from this stanza is that Cotton Eye Joe is black. Like, confirmed black. Like, we kinda already knew before, but now it's official. His teeth was out and his nose was flat. His eyes was crossed, but she didn't mind that, 'cause he was tall and very slim, and so my girl, she followed him. I'd have been married 40 years ago if it hadn't have been for Cotton Eye Joe. She was the prettiest girl to be found anywhere in the country around. Her lips was red and her eyes was bright. Her skin was black, but her teeth was white. I'd have been married 40 years ago if it hadn't have been for Cotton Eye Joe. Once again, the description of Cotton Eye Joe is contrasted with a beautiful description of the girl, this time with black skin being substituted for kinky hair. Both of these descriptions actually stood out to me when I first read them, because you really don't see kinky hair or dark skin being described as beautiful that often, especially on women, so it's nice to see. The final stanza reads, "That girl she sure had all my love, and swore for me she'd never move. But Joe hoodooed her, don't you see, and she run off with him to Tennessee. I'd have been married 40 years ago if it hadn't have been for Cotton Eye Joe." The 1882/1910 version of this song was sad. The 1925 version is bitter. No longer is the narrator mourning the loss of potential romance. Their heart has been hardened by the passage of time, and now they're deeply and outwardly resentful of Cotton Eye Joe. They even accuse him of using hoodoo magic to make the girl fall in love with him, because there's no other way anyone could ever fall head over heels for someone like Cotton Eye Joe. Since then, there have been several renditions of the song Cotton Eye Joe, many of them being compiled on the Wikipedia page. But one version in particular that's missing from the Wikipedia page is the version that got me interested in the song to begin with, and that's the one from African American Folk Rhythms, an album made by Ella Jenkins and the Goodwill Spiritual Choir of Monumental Baptist Church in 1960. It reads like this. "Where did you come from? Where did you go? Where did you come from, old Cotton Eye Joe? Oh, Cotton Eye Joe." These are the lines most people are familiar with when it comes to Cotton Eye Joe. We don't know where he came from, and we don't know where he went. You might be tempted, as I am, to think that this feature was added later, that Cotton Eye Joe was always going off to Tennessee, and that it's only in later versions that artists pretended not to know where he went. However, it's important to remember that even when those older versions we looked at were written down, there were still several alternatives floating around the southeastern United States. To this day, there is still no official canon of whether or not we know where Cotton Eye Joe went, because it's a folk song, and that's just kind of how folk songs work. There are several different versions, none of them standard, and which one you know depends on where you grew up and or who you learned it from. Next stanza. "I come for to see you, I come for to sing, I come for to show you my little diamond ring, my little diamond ring." So I guess I should explain this 4-2 thing we've been seeing. In Old Ebonics, that is not the proper term. In Old AVE, the construction 4-2 is used to denote purpose, like in order to. Meanwhile, 2 on its own is used to denote physical motion and location. This is important because it helps us understand what's being said in this stanza. Cotton Eye Joe has presumably come back specifically for the purpose of singing to the narrator and showing the narrator his little diamond ring. The next stanza reads, "My ring shines like silver, my ring shines like gold. I'm gonna give it to my little Cindy Jane, hers for to hold, hers for to hold." So who is Cindy Jane? Well, probably the girl who ran off to be with Cotton Eye Joe. Cindy Jane is the girl with the bright eyes and the red lips, the dark skin and white teeth, and kinky hair on her head. Cotton Eye Joe has come back to brag to the narrator about how he plans to marry Cindy Jane. The song finishes out by repeating the first two stanzas. Where did you come from? Where did you go? Where did you come from? Old Cotton Eye Joe. Old Cotton Eye Joe. I come for to see you. I come for to sing. I come for to show you my little diamond ring. My little diamond ring. The Ella Jenkins version seems cruel at first glance. It looks like Cotton Eye Joe knew the narrator was in love with Cindy Jane and is trying to rub it in the narrator's face that he gets to marry her. However, we have to consider the possibility that Cotton Eye Joe didn't know Cindy Jane and the narrator had a romance going on. What if Joe was completely oblivious to the relationship between the narrator and Cindy Jane and is just excited to show off the fact that he's getting married? That would place the blame on Cindy Jane for being unfaithful, right? No, not necessarily. Remember, we also don't know that Cindy Jane sees the narrator the same way the narrator sees her. It's possible that this is a one-sided crush, that Cindy Jane loves the narrator as a close friend, but not as a lover. That place in her heart is reserved for Cotton Eye Joe. Last but not least, we've arrived at the version of the song that most people are familiar with, the 1994 Eurodance version by Rednex, a Swedish band that uses negative stereotypes about rural white Southerners for their own monetary gain. Anyways, if it hadn't been for Cotton Eye Joe, I'd been married a long time ago. Where did you come from? Where did you go? Where did you come from, Cotton Eye Joe? This one stanza is repeated 11 times total throughout the song. Needless to say, I will not be reading it 11 times. Instead, I'll be reading it once and highlighting the other two verses in this song, which are: He came to town like a midwinter storm. He rode through the fields so handsome and strong. His eyes was his tools and his smile was his gun, but all he had come for was having some fun. It's worth noting that here, Cotton Eye Joe is specifically described as being handsome. This is a complete contrast to all the versions we've seen before. Before, he was always implied to be strikingly unattractive, in contrast with the beauty of the girl that ran off to be with him. I mean, it's been over 100 years, I think it's about time he got a glow up. He brought disaster wherever he went, the hearts of the girls was to hell broken sent. They all ran away so nobody would know, and left only men 'cause of Cotton Eye Joe. The Rednex description of Cotton Eye Joe is hands down the most dramatic of all the ones we've looked at so far. What was once a simple, sad story of lost love has become heavily mythologized almost to the point of a legend. No longer is Cotton Eye Joe just some ugly guy who Cindy Jane likes for some reason. Now he's a disaster, a midwinter storm, sending the souls of all the girls to hell in pieces, using his eyes like tools and his smile like a gun. But of course, as we saw before, he's not malicious or mean. All he wanted was to have some fun. As you can see, there have been many different renditions of the song Cotton Eye Joe throughout the decades, and there are plenty more not covered in this video. Bob Wills sings about the song itself in his version, and maybe implies Joe was a doctor, while Nina Simone refers to him as my Cotton Eye Joe. A couple of the versions by white Southerners contain the line, "Daddy worked a man named Cotton Eye Joe," implying that Joe is a slave or a sharecropper, and the narrator is the child of the plantation owner. As time progresses, I'm sure there will be more and more different adaptations of this 100-year-old folk song, and I hope knowing a little bit more about the history behind it will help us appreciate those new songs even more. So, I know I said I want Imagination Productions to be a variety content channel, and there's no reason I can't just make a video like this without making a song to go with it. But, I mean, It just wouldn't be right to do a video essay about the history of Cotton Eye Joe without making my own Dirty South remix of the traditional folk song. So,